At Coder Foundry, we're getting ready to go through a little bit of a transition as we prep and get ready to teach .NET 8. And specifically, we're moving away from building apps with MVC, and we're going to utilize the Blazor framework. Now, this has caused us to do a lot of research because we're having to use the .NET 8 preview. And naturally, questions arise when you're trying to do this. And we figure if we have questions about some of these things, then a lot of other people will too. Now, one of the first questions everyone will run into is, what are Blazor render modes? And you may be asking yourself, what is a render mode? But if you know what they are, then you're also probably wondering, when do I use them? What do I use them for? And what do they really do? These are all questions we had in researching Blazor with .NET 8. So we built an application called Blazor Movie to explore these different render modes. And we're going to give that app to you. So let's take a look. So what we built here is a Blazor application that explores the render modes. And you can see here on the home page, we have a write-up about each type and the pros and cons and kind of the common use cases for each of these render modes. And we've grouped them together. Blazor WASM down here with auto, SignalR kind of sits in the middle. And then we have our SSR modes, whether that be streaming or standard SSR. All of those are our 5 render modes that we're going to discuss in kind of detail today and how they work. This application here uses the MovieDB API to bring back movies, but each page is used a different render mode. And so it shows you kind of how they work and how they behave. Now notice here, I've got these cards here, and I click a more button and I pop a modal, which has detailed information about the movie. Okay. So I'm going to go over how each of these work and show you how the differences between the render modes. And I think this will help you understand when I should use them, where I should build them. Now, what of note is what's very powerful about Blazor is that these render modes aren't on a page by page basis. They're on a component by component basis. What means that a page can have one-to-many components, and each of those components can be rendered with a different mode. And this is very powerful. And it's one of the reasons people are so excited about .NET 8, in that I no longer have to figure out, do I want to run this on the server or do I run it on the client, and have to pick one way to build my entire application. Now I can mix and match these render modes to make it the best use case for the particular component or page as I'm building out my whole app as a whole. And that's very powerful. So let's talk a little bit about the render modes and explain what they are. So Blazor, if you didn't know, is a web application development framework. It's built and maintained by Microsoft, and it's used primarily to build web applications to bring rich UI interactivity. Now, they are exploring and trying to bring this into the desktop arena, maybe the mobile arena. But right now, today, as we talk about this, we're primarily concerned with web application development. Now, the tooling, the components, and the framework makes building applications, I think, easy and fast, especially when you compare it to things like React or Angular and even MVC. So when we are building apps with MVC for the past several years, and I think this is a game changer in the speed at which we can build apps, but also the capabilities, which is you'll see that we can do a lot of the interactivity with minimal to no JavaScript. Now, we're never going to get totally rid of JavaScript because that's kind of how browsers work. So you need JavaScript to do certain things. But the common things like I want to filter a grid, or I want to click on a button, I want something to happen, no longer those interactions have to be built with JavaScript. We can run those inside a Blazor, and it can behave like a SPA framework, like it runs on the client, or that process can even be run on the server, but it still behaves like a client-side app. And that is very powerful. And that's why people are very excited about Blazor. So let's explore these render modes to show you how this works. With Blazor under .NET 8, we have basically 5 render modes and 1 behavior. We have a behavior called Enhanced Navigation, and then we have these 5 render modes. We have server-side rendered, or SSR. We have streaming rendered, or SSR streaming. We have server mode, or with SignalR, and WebAssembly, what we call WASM, and finally we have the new auto mode in .NET 8. So enhanced page navigation, Blazor supports this by intercepting the request. And in order to apply to the response to the existing DOM, preserving as much as possible. So let me show you how this works, all right? So if you pay attention to the app here, let's look at the home page here and also watch what happens here in the top of the browser here. So you can see here, if I hit refresh, this has a little spinner and it refreshes the page. I'll do that again. And it refreshes the page. In this case, the entire page was downloaded. But if I click over here to Movie SSR, you'll notice that it doesn't reload the page. It just does the middle parts. And now my navigation and even my footer has already been loaded, and it makes a smoother transition from page to page. All right, so if we go back over here, you'll notice that it doesn't load the page anymore. It just puts the things in the middle that it needs. So it's pretty smart about what's currently in the DOM, and let me just send you just the changes, and that's enhanced navigation. And so we call this a behavior because this isn't something that we set. This just kind of works out of the box. So let's talk about server-side rendered, and what server-side rendered does. Let's say that we have a browser and it sends a request to go to a page. And so I want to go to mywebsite.com/index, or you can think of it as going to that index here on Blazor Movie. Okay. When we hit that index, it goes to the server. The server will say, okay, what page is it? And if it needs to go to the database or whatever it has to do, it's going to return a payload in the response, which will be the complete HTML page. All right. And so this is a complete server-side rendered full page, static page that comes back to the browser. Now you may be asking yourself a question, well, isn't that a lot like MVC or Razor pages today? And the answer is, yeah, it's exactly like that. It behaves the same way. And people think, well, why don't we just continue to use MVC? And that's a valid question. The reason is components, because components, we don't really have a great component story with MVC or Razor pages, but now under Blazor we do. So we get the same benefit of a really fast server response. We get a full static page rendered, which means our security and everything runs on the server and we just resend results back. And this is really quick. But we can also use components to build our page. And that's a game changer for a Blazor. So let's talk about the next thing that happens here. And I'm going to demo this one. Let's talk about streaming mode. Let's say that we have, a web page that maybe has some movies in it. All right. And that could be a long running process. So what we could do is send a request that goes to movies, and then it comes back with the first payload. And so the first payload would be just some HTML that it knows it can load. This could be maybe an H1 tag that says popular movies. I'll show you this in a second. And then some placeholder content while the process runs. And then behind the scenes, the request is still open. It doesn't close the request after this first response. It keeps it open and eventually sends a second payload with the HTML for just the movies, not the whole page, just the movies. And this is kind of powerful. All right, so let's look at that. So I'm going to go over here to this SSR mode here, and you can see right away that it just comes up here and just brings up our movies. Now in streaming mode, and I've got a purposeful delay in here to show you how this works. So watch what happens here. So when I stream it out, you can see the H1 tag for popular movies came up, but also had the placeholder content. And then after 3 seconds, because I put a delay in there, the movies render and appear. So let's do that one more time. I'm going to refresh the page here. And you can notice here, we got our placeholder content and boom, and then our movies appear. And this is pretty powerful. Now you can put whatever you want in here. And by default, it has like spinning loaders and those types of things. And what I'm using here to do this is Bootstrap with placeholder content. It gives us a little animation like it's loading that mimics what the content's gonna look like. I think that's a good way to do it. And I'll show you when you download the code, you can see how we did this with Bootstrap. Okay, the next mode that we're going to talk about is Signal R, and this is what used to be called Blazor Server. So if you've been watching Blazor for a while over the years and the releases came out, we had something called Blazor Server. And we're just going to call it Server Mode now, or Signal R. The reason I call it Signal R is because the other one is called Server Side Rendered, and this is called Server. They're different modes and they behave completely differently, all right? But they're kind of named similarly. So I just call it Signal R mode. And what this happens is I go to the request to request my movies, and then it sends a response with the HTML page, and then it also has a runtime to establish a Signal R connection to the DOM. Okay, so every element in the DOM is now on the server. And what this can do, as I have interactive components, I use Signal R to figure out the changes that are required for the DOM. And any events that are sent back to the server, it sends back data that is then inserted or patched in or overlaid into the DOM. And this is very powerful. So this is a lot like if you've been building JavaScript sites before using React, Angular, even vanilla JavaScript. You basically would have to do something like get element by ID, and then you call an API endpoint, the data comes back in, and then you map that data into the DOM with code. This at Blazor does this automatically, and this is very powerful. So let me show you kind of how this works. All right, so I'm going to go over to the Signal R mode page here, and it's going to connect up. And then I've got a delay in here as well. This is a lot faster than normally. And I've got a delay here and it loads in my movies. And you're saying, well, that's just like streaming. It is, but I want to show you this. Notice here that I have a more info button. And so now once I'm here, I need to pop a modal and then fill that modal full of information. All right, so it's going to load out there, call my API, and then it takes that and pulls all that information from my API request and it just patches it into the modal. So I don't have a copy of this modal for every movie. I have one template that when I click on a different more info button, it loads in, and now all of these are dynamically placed in it. Now, what you should know is this takes zero JavaScript to do. Basically, I have an object on the back end that is called movie details. And if movie details changes, this component will render whatever exists inside the movie details change. I don't have to tell it to render. I don't have to write JavaScript to do that. I just change the object underlying in my code, and this thing will render correctly. It's pretty powerful. So we can look at one more here. Look at maybe Spider-Man here, and you can see here it's loading in. And I've also put a delay in there to show you that the component can also tell you that it's loading, and then when the change happens, it displays it correctly. So what's real important to notice here is that when I click more info here, I've actually already displayed the modal. The modal's there, and then my async process completes, and then it binds it into the DOM. It's pretty powerful, and no JavaScript to do that. So let's look at WebAssembly. And WebAssembly is, you know, what got initially everyone excited about Blazor when we saw this the first time. We're like, wow, I don't have to write JavaScript. I can run C# on my client. And think of this as a replacement, or it does the same thing as the React and Angular frameworks. So if you're looking at JavaScript front-end frameworks, WebAssembly sits alongside of those. And so typically if you're looking at building a client-side project, you're going to either pick Blazor WebAssembly or React or Angular. You don't use these in conjunction with each other. They are separate and they do the same thing. So if we request over to the movies, and then we're running this under WebAssembly, the response comes back and it has an HTML page, and then the .NET and the WebAssembly runtime have to download. And this is one of the weaknesses of WebAssembly, is that it will take a second for this to happen depending on what's downloading. And so you do have a delay for your initial load. And initially, a lot of people didn't like this. They're like, oh, I can't use that because I have an initial download time. And so that is it's kind of a weakness to the framework. But if you can get over that, it's pretty powerful once you get the app started up. All right. Now, it is kind of architected differently. Before with server, we're just making calls to our back end, and it comes back with it comes back with a response. But now we have to use HTTP client over and calling out to an API. And so an API is the architecture for WebAssembly is a little bit different, a little bit more complex, and but it is the same as if you were running Angular or React. You have some type of API backend. You issue either a fetch, and the HTTP client is the C# equivalent to that. And so we get JSON back, and then when those results come back, components detect their changes and they update their own DOM. And so this is where it does change from other frameworks, in that the only thing that happens is that I get a result back. And because that result came back, components will detect their own changes and map them in the DOM. So I don't have to write all of this DOM update code, especially if you're using something like vanilla JavaScript, where you write get them out by ID, look for a response, make sure it comes back. None of that plumbing that you have to do. WebAssembly takes care of all of that. You just call the HTTP client or call the web API with HTTP client. The JSON comes back, and then the components do the rest. It's kind of powerful. And this is why people are really excited about that. And finally, we have auto mode. And I do believe when you talk about how our app's going to get built, how our enterprise is going to adopt Blazor, I think this is the one that they're going to adopt, okay? So the request will go out to movies, and initially it's going to come back with a server-side rendered application. It'll come back with just the HTML and a SignalR connection, just like it does in Blazor server. Okay, so it's rendered on the server and comes down. Now in the background, it will download WebAssembly in the background. So on a different thread, it will download that. And then the next time you make a call, it works just like WebAssembly, because it'll run on the client at that point. So it can either run on the server while it's downloading WebAssembly in the background, and then the next call will go over to HTTP client and then pull this back as a JSON response and update the DOM just like in WebAssembly mode. And so this requires a little bit of pre-planning, like how you build your components, whether they run on the server or on the client, a little bit of architecture and how you build this out. But I think when you go to very complex or bigger websites, auto mode is kind of where everyone's going to land. But the really cool thing about Blazor is that you can do this on a component by component basis. So let's talk about one quick thing here we did on the homepage here, and we'll get out of here. So server-side rendered is this really quick framework that brings back a complete HTML page, and it's a static HTML, and it's really fast. And so one of the use cases that I think is going to come here is that if you have a landing page, a contact page, and maybe even dashboards, content that's generally only read-only, you can just render that with the SSR, and then you can render everything else and run it on the client if you have an application. All right. So if you build an application, say a bug tracker, and people are managing tickets and sending out emails and notifications and all those kind of things, all of that can run on client side. But you could have a landing page that just has your static content that tells people about the app or where to log in, or just present them with a login page. That could be done server side because it'd be fast. They don't have to download WebAssembly to do it. And so you can really start mixing and matching all of these render modes to do it. And I believe that when we get down to auto right here, this is how the enterprise is going to do this. They're going to use a mixture of SignalR and WASM for their components and let the browser figure out which way to run it in auto mode. And then for everything else that's static, they're just going to run this as SSR and maybe even a stream. So I can see us building out a dashboard for something that you log into, and the dashboard has like 3 graphs and a grid on it. And you could run most of that static, comes back, just displays, but you could also stream in and use a streaming mode to stream in just the component that may has a grid of rows or tickets in it. Maybe there's a lot of them, or 10,000 items or whatever. You could do that. Or maybe this component was also in the dashboard, could be a SignalR component. So maybe you have two graphs and a grid, and the grid has filtering and sorting and a lot of interactivity, you could build that component to run through SignalR, and everything else on the page could be server-side rendered. And it can make your pages fast, responsive, and also give you the ability to write these really rich UIs. And we think that this is why people are excited about Blazor. Go to GitHub, clone or download the repo, run it, and get familiar with Blazor, because in 2024, a lot of companies are going to be adopting this. Here at Coder Foundry, this is what we're going to be teaching going forward, because we believe that this is how people are going to be building web applications in the future, specifically with .NET. And so we want to make sure that you have all the training you need to be relevant in the job market. I hope this helps. Good luck and keep coding.